The sentence was only 9 words long, but it struck the royal family with the force of a constitutional earthquake. Lady Louise Windsor, normally the quietest figure in the room, looked directly toward her uncle and declared, "Andrew will never walk these palace halls." No hesitation, no softening. And as the final word left her lips, King Charles realized this was no youthful outburst. It was a boundary the next generation intended to defend. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had called the private gathering inside St. George's Hall to discuss whether Andrew could quietly return to selected family occasions. The Great Chamber was being used not for ceremony, but for judgment. Prince William, Princess Anne, Prince Edward, Sophie, Louise, and the disgraced Duke were all present. A Duke is a senior royal title, but that rank carried no power to erase years of damage or restore trust automatically. Louise rose from her chair before anyone could soften the proposal. Her hands trembled, yet her voice remained steady. She demanded that Andrew lose private access to Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, Sandringham, and Balmoral. These occupied royal residences were not simply historic buildings. They were working family homes, protected spaces, and symbols of the monarchy's moral authority. Edward stared at his daughter with paternal fear. He understood that she had crossed from private concern into direct confrontation with an older royal. Yet Louise did not sit down. Andrew looked at her in disbelief. "Do you understand whom you are addressing?" "I understand exactly," she answered. "And family rank cannot erase the humiliation everyone else has been forced to carry." The words landed with controlled fury. Louise had not spoken through an interview or public statement. Her position was later preserved in a documented account of the sealed family meeting, confirming that the challenge had been delivered directly, with every senior figure present. William did not defend Andrew. Instead, the future king quietly closed the folder before him. The gesture suggested Louise had not spoken into an empty room. Her demand may already have reflected the private position of the heir. Charles refused to dismiss what had happened. He ordered the doors closed and declared that no one would leave until he understood why his niece had chosen that moment. Anne turned toward Sophie and saw her gripping the edge of her chair. The princess immediately understood that Louise's words were not spontaneous. Something had happened before the gathering, something strong enough to transform the family's most restrained young woman into its fiercest voice. Louise had delivered the sentence, but the deeper shock lay in the faces around her, because every person in that sealed room had something different to lose if Andrew's final palace door was closed. Lady Louise had spent most of her life avoiding the spotlight that followed her family. She did not seek authority, headlines, or a place at the center of royal conflict. That was precisely why her intervention terrified the room. When the quietest person finally speaks, everyone listens differently. Yet behind her extraordinary declaration stood 3 wounded people: a daughter protecting her family, a father fearing the consequences, and an uncle who still believed the palace owed him belonging. Louise had built a reputation for watching more than she spoke. She remained private, loyal to Edward and Sophie, and careful never to create difficulty for the family. As her parents accepted heavier royal duties, she saw them carry greater responsibility without complaint. Royal duties meant official work performed on behalf of the monarch, often requiring discipline, travel, and public service without personal freedom. Louise respected that sacrifice because she had watched its cost at home. Andrew saw Windsor differently. To him, those corridors represented childhood, rank, identity, and the final proof that he still belonged to the dynasty. Losing access would not feel like a change in security. It would feel like erasure. Edward found Louise alone after the meeting and asked whether anyone had encouraged her to speak. The question wounded her immediately. "No one told me what to say," she answered. "I said it because I have watched you carry responsibility while others still demand privilege without sacrifice." Edward turned away. He understood her anger, but he also knew that confronting Andrew had placed his daughter inside a conflict powerful people had avoided for years. Sophie entered moments later. She placed a hand on Louise's shoulder and admitted she was proud of her courage. Then her voice softened. She was frightened by the enemies that courage might create. Louise remained steady, but the trusted confidant could feel tension beneath her silence. Anne soon drew William aside. Through a documented account of their private exchange, she noted that Louise had used language resembling a confidential palace access review. That review was a restricted assessment deciding which royal residences an individual could enter and under what conditions. Only a small number of senior figures had seen it. William admitted he had discussed limiting Andrew's movements with Charles, but he had never shown Louise the document. The revelation raised a darker question. She had not repeated official wording by accident. She had learned something through another route. Andrew began to understand before anyone confronted him. Weeks earlier, Louise had unexpectedly found him outside a room he had been expressly forbidden to enter. The declaration in St. George's Hall was not the beginning of Louise's anger. It was the release of something she had carried since one forbidden encounter changed how she saw her uncle forever. 3 weeks before the family confrontation, Lady Louise had entered Windsor Castle, expecting nothing more dramatic than an afternoon visit with her parents. Instead, she found Prince Andrew alone, in a restricted corridor, beside the late Queen's sealed private rooms. One hand rested on the brass handle. No equerry stood nearby. No permission had been issued. When he turned and saw his niece watching him, neither spoke for several seconds, and those seconds became the point of no return. The late Queen's private apartments had been sealed, while her personal items, correspondence, and ceremonial objects were being catalogued. Cataloging meant recording each object carefully so nothing could be removed, altered, or lost without notice. Entry required written approval from the sovereign's household because those rooms held family memories, sensitive papers, and objects tied directly to the former monarch's private life. Louise had accompanied Sophie to Windsor and briefly separated from her after delivering a personal box to a nearby sitting room. The unfamiliar route brought her into the restricted eastern corridor. She stopped when she saw Andrew beside the locked door. Louise asked why he was there. Andrew replied that he did not require permission to stand outside his mother's rooms. He told her not to confuse new palace procedures with moral authority. The answer carried more than irritation. It suggested he believed family history placed him above restrictions created after Elizabeth's death. Louise reminded him that the rule applied to everyone. Andrew dismissed her as a child who did not understand the family's past. She absorbed the insult without answering. Then he added that Windsor would always belong more to him than to peripheral relatives. The word struck hard. Louise understood he was not only defending access, he was ranking bloodlines, sacrifice, and belonging. Sophie arrived moments later and saw Andrew stepping away from the handle. He insisted nothing had happened. The trusted confidant looked from him to her daughter, sensing the tension immediately. Louise noticed something neither of them mentioned aloud. A copied access card was partly visible inside Andrew's coat pocket. She reported the encounter to Edward that evening. Through their documented private conversation, her father asked her to remain silent, while Charles investigated discreetly. Louise agreed because she trusted him. But days passed. No visible action followed, and Andrew remained invited to the family meeting. Louise entered St. George's Hall, believing the incident had been minimized. Then Charles proposed limited private access, and silence suddenly felt like surrender. The forbidden corridor had given Louise the reason to speak, but now she would have to face Andrew across the same table and explain why one moment had destroyed whatever trust remained between them. Andrew did not shout when he challenged Lady Louise. His calmness was more dangerous than anger. He pushed his chair backwards, stood across from his niece, and told her to repeat the words while looking directly into his face. The room tightened around them. Edward moved instinctively toward his daughter, but Louise raised one hand to stop him. Then she met her uncle's stare and repeated the sentence slower, colder, and without changing a single word. Charles kept the doors closed and asked whether her declaration had been caused by the restricted corridor encounter. Louise confirmed it. She described finding Andrew beside the late Queen's sealed rooms and seeing a copied access card partly hidden inside his coat. The king understood why that detail mattered. An access card is an electronic pass used to enter protected palace areas, and any copied version suggested someone had tried to bypass normal permission. Andrew denied attempting to enter. He argued that standing outside his mother's rooms was neither misconduct nor defiance. Louise answered that his hand had been resting on the door handle. The Duke stepped closer and demanded that she withdraw the accusation. Edward moved between them. Louise gently shifted beside her father. "I will not hide behind him." Her words unsettled Edward. Yet he did not stop her. She told Andrew that the dispute was not about one locked door. It was about his belief that every boundary became negotiable whenever it caused him discomfort. Years of scandal had already forced the family to defend limits publicly, while he continued treating those limits as temporary insults. Andrew's expression hardened. He accused Louise of betraying Elizabeth's devotion to him and twisting a mother's love into evidence against her own son. Sophie responded without raising her voice. She placed the copied card on the table and revealed through her documented account that Louise had picked it up after it fell from Andrew's coat as he left the corridor. The trusted confidant had preserved it because she feared the incident would otherwise be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Anne took the card and turned it over. She recognized an outdated security mark linked to a former household office. That discovery changed everything. The pass could not have become active by accident. Someone inside the palace system may have helped restore it. Charles did not defend his brother. The king called for the security director and ordered an immediate audit, a formal examination of access records, permissions, and staff actions. The family dispute had become an investigation, and no private promise could now make it disappear. Louise had survived the face-to-face challenge, but the card on the table shifted the balance of power because the final decision would now belong to whoever controlled the palace gates. Royal palaces carry the weight of history, but their doors do not open through memory alone. Access is granted by authority, recorded by security, and withdrawn by the sovereign. That reality now confronted King Charles with brutal clarity. Andrew was his brother, Louise was his niece, and the disputed corridor had belonged to their mother. Yet as the copied card lay under the chandelier's light, Charles understood that affection could no longer decide who crossed the threshold. Charles held final authority over access to occupied royal residences, but he did not control every lock alone. Household security, property officials, and senior advisors made operational recommendations based on risk, privacy, and the needs of the working monarchy. That distinction mattered because Windsor was not simply a family home. It was also a protected royal residence where official business, private records, and future constitutional responsibilities remained closely guarded. William argued that one uncontrolled exception could weaken every rule that followed. The prince understood that palace security depended on consistency. If Andrew could bypass restrictions because of birth, every future boundary would become open to negotiation, pressure, or personal favor. Charles withdrew to a side chamber and read the initial audit alone. An audit is a formal review of records used to identify who authorized an action and whether proper rules were followed. The king removed his glasses, placed the report face down, and remained silent. Edward waited near the doorway, torn between sympathy for his brother and the instinct to protect Louise. He finally told Charles that his daughter should never have been forced to say what senior royals had avoided saying for years. Charles accepted the criticism without interruption. The report confirmed that the copied access card had been reactivated for exactly 11 minutes on the afternoon of the corridor incident. The approval came through a retired staff credential that should have been permanently disabled. That detail destroyed any claim of administrative confusion. Anne recognized the credential immediately. It belonged to a former aide who had remained personally loyal to Andrew after leaving royal service. The princess understood what the evidence suggested. Someone had deliberately reached back into an outdated system to bypass the controls now surrounding the Duke. Charles returned to the room and signed a temporary suspension of Andrew's unsupervised access. The order applied immediately to every occupied royal residence. Andrew watched the ink settle and asked one question. "When does it expire?" Charles did not answer. The silence told everyone that the restriction might no longer be temporary. Something stronger was already being prepared. The signature removed Andrew's freedom for the night. But by morning, the decision had already begun changing homes, relationships, and loyalties throughout the royal family. The fallout did not arrive through a public proclamation. It came through small, merciless changes. A security code stopped working. A scheduled car was cancelled. A familiar entrance was removed from an itinerary. Prince Andrew learned the new reality not from a speech, but from a red light flashing against a card he had used for years. Behind him, the Windsor gate remained closed, and for the first time, he understood that Louise's words might become permanent policy. Charles's temporary order changed every part of Andrew's access. The Duke now had to request written permission before entering any occupied royal residence, and every approved visit required an escort and a clearly limited destination. An occupied royal residence is a palace or estate, still used for family life or official work, making access a matter of security rather than personal entitlement. Household staff received revised instructions before breakfast. Andrew could no longer arrive through private family entrances, move between rooms informally, or assume that long familiarity counted as approval. A planned Windsor luncheon was cancelled without negotiation. Andrew reached a side gate and presented his usual card. The reader flashed red. He tried again. A security officer quietly explained that the credential had been deactivated. Nearby staff lowered their eyes, offering him the dignity of pretending not to notice. Anger rose first, but humiliation quickly replaced it. The man who had once crossed those gates without question now stood outside, waiting for permission. Louise received her own punishment in a different form. A handwritten message arrived, accusing her of turning private grief into public punishment. She recognized Andrew's hand immediately. Alone, she read the words twice, folded the page carefully, and began to cry. She did not regret speaking. What broke through her control was the knowledge that the accusation had come from her uncle. William soon learned that Andrew had appealed directly to Charles. The Duke offered to surrender his remaining ceremonial privileges in exchange for continued private access to Windsor. Ceremonial privileges are formal honors, or appearances, connected to royal status, but they carry no automatic right to enter protected family spaces. Charles rejected the bargain. The king told him that security and trust could not be traded for titles, appearances, or promises of better behavior. Louise then considered withdrawing from public duties. She feared that remaining visible would deepen the hostility surrounding Edward and Sophie. The trusted confidant refused to let guilt make that choice for her, and asked to speak privately that night. The closed gate had wounded Andrew, but Louise now faced a more private danger, the fear that protecting the monarchy might cost her the family she had been trying to protect. The fallout did not arrive through a public proclamation. It came through small, merciless changes. A security code stopped working. A scheduled car was cancelled. A familiar entrance was removed from an itinerary. Prince Andrew learned the new reality, not from a speech, but from a red light flashing against a card he had used for years. Behind him, the Windsor gate remained closed, and for the first time he understood that Louise's words might become permanent policy. Charles's temporary order changed every condition surrounding Andrew's access. The Duke now had to request written permission before visiting any occupied royal residence, and every approved entry required an escort and a fixed destination. An occupied royal residence is a palace or estate still used for official work or private family life, which means entry is governed by security rather than personal history. Andrew had spent decades treating Windsor as home. Now even familiarity offered him no protection. Household staff received revised instructions before the next family gathering. Andrew could no longer arrive through private entrances, move between rooms without supervision, or assume that an invitation to one event granted access elsewhere. His planned attendance at a Windsor luncheon was cancelled, and no substitute arrangement was offered. Andrew reached a side gate and presented the card he had used for years. The reader flashed red. He tried again. A security officer quietly explained that the credential had been deactivated. Nearby staff avoided meeting his eyes. Andrew's first reaction was anger, but humiliation quickly replaced it. He was no longer arguing about access in a sealed room. He was standing outside the gates, experiencing the decision as reality. Louise received a different kind of punishment. A brief handwritten message accused her of turning private grief into public humiliation. She recognized her uncle's handwriting immediately. Alone, she read it twice, folded the page carefully, and began to cry. Louise did not regret speaking. What wounded her was knowing that Andrew now saw her not as family, but as the person responsible for his exclusion. William soon learned that Andrew had appealed directly to Charles. The Duke offered to surrender every remaining ceremonial privilege in exchange for continued private access to Windsor. Ceremonial privileges are formal honors and appearances connected to royal status, but they do not create a right to enter protected spaces. Charles rejected the bargain. The king told his brother that security and trust could not be exchanged for titles, public appearances, or promises of improved behavior. Louise then considered withdrawing from public duties to protect Edward and Sophie from further hostility. The trusted confidant refused to let guilt decide her daughter's future and asked to meet her alone that night. The closed gate had wounded Andrew, but Louise now faced a more private danger, the fear that protecting the monarchy might cost her the family she had been trying to protect. That night, there were no advisors, no security reports, and no senior royals calculating consequences. Sophie sat beside her daughter in a small private room and allowed the silence to settle. Louise finally admitted what she had hidden throughout the confrontation. She was afraid her father would be punished socially for her courage, afraid her grandmother would have disapproved, and afraid that telling the truth had made her cruel. Sophie's answer changed the direction of the entire crisis. Sophie had asked Edward to leave them alone. She removed the palace briefing folder from the table and placed it beyond reach, making clear that this would not be a discussion between royal figures. A palace briefing folder is a collection of official notes, security findings, and recommendations prepared for senior members of the family. None of that mattered in this moment. Only a mother and daughter remained. Louise admitted that she had never wanted to lead a campaign against Andrew. Her anger came from watching rules treated as optional, while Edward and Sophie carried growing responsibilities without demanding special treatment. She had seen her parents accept duty quietly, only to watch others claim privilege, as though sacrifice belonged to everyone else. Then Louise said she wanted to apologize publicly. Sophie took both her hands. She told her that feeling sorrow for another person's pain did not mean the boundary itself was wrong. Compassion could recognize Andrew's humiliation without pretending that his conduct deserved no consequence. "I was frightened when you stood," Sophie admitted, "but I was not ashamed." The trusted confidant explained that silence might have protected comfort, but speaking had protected the institution Louise could one day serve. Courage was not cruelty simply because it caused discomfort. Edward joined them only after the private conversation ended. He revealed that Charles had requested Louise's presence the following morning. The king did not want a retraction. He wanted her account formally recorded, a documented statement, preserved as part of the official review. Charles later told Louise that the final access order would not rest on her declaration alone. It would be based on the copied card, the reactivated credential, and the attempt to bypass palace controls. Her courage had exposed the problem, but evidence would decide the punishment. Louise left the king's room carrying less guilt, though not less responsibility. William met her outside and assured her she would not stand alone when the decision became public. Within hours, that promise would be tested. The private guilt had lifted from Louise's shoulders, but outside the family walls her sentence was becoming a national symbol no palace official could contain. By sunrise, the words belonged to everyone. "Andrew will never walk these palace halls," appeared across broadcasts, phone screens, and newspaper stands before the royal household could issue a complete statement. Some heard courage, others heard cruelty. Yet the image that defined the morning was not a television debate or a palace briefing. It was a silent crowd outside Windsor Castle, staring at the closed gate, where Andrew's car had once passed without challenge. The palace confirmed that Andrew's unsupervised access to occupied royal residences had been suspended following an internal security review. An internal security review is a formal examination of permissions, staff actions, and access records used to decide whether royal protections were breached. Officials avoided repeating Louise's statement, but they did not deny that she had spoken during the family meeting. That silence allowed the sentence to grow beyond palace control. Commentators divided over whether a younger royal should have confronted a senior relative so directly. Yet the deeper argument was no longer about manners. It was about whether blood, rank, and history should ever override modern standards of trust and accountability. Edward feared Louise would be reduced to a dramatic headline rather than understood as a daughter who had witnessed a serious breach. He wanted to protect her from becoming the public face of a family punishment. Sophie disagreed. The trusted confidant warned that hiding their daughter completely would make it appear that the palace was ashamed of her courage. Andrew watched the coverage alone. He remained still until one broadcaster called Louise the quiet Windsor, who finally said no. Then he switched off the television and sat in silence. The words stripped away his anger, leaving only defeat. His niece had become a symbol of resistance, while he had become the man standing outside the gate. The Crown Chronicle intensified the pressure, with a front page showing Windsor's locked iron gates beneath the headline, "The Palace Line." By midday, a crowd gathered near the Long Walk. Several people placed white roses beside the barrier, honoring the late Queen while supporting stronger limits around her private spaces. William then issued a brief statement, praising those who defended royal institutions through duty rather than entitlement. He did not name Louise, but no one misunderstood him. The future king had placed moral support behind her, without turning the crisis into a personal attack. Charles now faced a decision that could no longer be delayed. He summoned Andrew, Louise, Edward, and William to one final meeting. The temporary suspension would either be softened or transformed into a permanent royal order. The nation had delivered its reaction, but only one voice could turn the closed gate from a moment of scandal into the permanent verdict of the crown. The final meeting contained none of the fury that had ignited the crisis. There were no raised voices and no dramatic accusations. Charles sat at the head of the table with the completed security review before him. Andrew faced the brother who could still offer compassion but no longer protection. Louise sat beside Edward, calm despite the weight of what her words had set in motion. Then the king read the decision that permanently changed who could call the palace home. Charles began with the evidence. The security review confirmed that Andrew had knowingly possessed an unauthorized access card and used an intermediary's expired credentials to approach restricted royal apartments without approval. A security review is a formal investigation of access records, permissions, and staff actions used to determine whether protected rules were broken. The findings removed every remaining claim that the corridor incident had been an innocent misunderstanding. The king then delivered the permanent order. Andrew would no longer hold independent access to any occupied royal residence. Every future visit would require a direct invitation, advance approval, security supervision, and clear limits on where he could go. The decision mattered because it separated family contact from automatic privilege. He would not be erased as a brother, but he would no longer enter royal spaces simply because he had once belonged there freely. Andrew asked for one final private visit to the late Queen's sealed corridor. Charles refused. Grief cannot be honored through another exception to the rule that was broken, he said. Louise looked toward her uncle and told him she had not spoken because she hated him. She had spoken because belonging to the royal family also meant accepting boundaries. Andrew studied her for several seconds before quietly admitting that she had shown the courage others had avoided. Charles made the distinction clear. Louise had not personally banned Andrew through 9 dramatic words. Her declaration forced the crown to confront evidence it had been reluctant to face, while the investigation supplied the lawful and institutional basis for the restriction. Edward placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder as William signed the implementation order as witness. An implementation order is the formal document that turns a royal decision into rules household officials must enforce. Anne watched without celebration, understanding that the monarchy had protected itself only by accepting pain within its own family. Andrew left through a supervised side entrance and did not look back. Louise remained inside, changed but not triumphant. Inherited status had finally yielded to earned trust. And so Louise's 9 words became more than a shocking statement. They became the boundary that closed one chapter of royal privilege and opened another, defined by accountability, courage, and duty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.